in this today's session.
It gives me a great honor and pleasure to introduce Gordon Lewis, who studied at various universities in the USA, in New York, at Brown University. He graduated with a PhD at Yale University. But he also has experience and knowledge about continental philosophy. He studied in France. He's in collaboration with South African universities. He's currently also professor at the University of Connecticut. And he is an expert in a much needed area, which is Africana philosophy. He is familiar with existential philosophy, phenomenology, social and political theory, post-colonial thought. He also is the author of an important book of philosopher Fanon, Franz Fanon. The title of this book is What Fanon Said, a philosophical introduction to his life and thought, which proves exactly the point that philosophy is not necessarily a textual. It can be also beyond textuality. And today we invited him because we want to know more about African philosophy. I was always wondered whether African philosophy can start with Augustine, or whether Augustine is the first important or first major African philosopher. I'm sure this is not true. But I hope that Professor Gordon Lewis will clarify for us what are the origins and interpretations, ancient or modern, of Africana philosophy. Professor Gordon Lewis, welcome.
Well, thank you, Ionut, and thank you to the community for this meeting. I've been enjoying the conversations. I have a lot to say, so I'll just get straight to it, okay? The first, I want to make sure you can all hear me okay, right? Oh, good. Okay, so just to get straight to it, basically discussing African philosophy, and you notice, although Ionut brought up Africana philosophy, just to put it on the table, Africana is diasporic, and African tends to focus very specifically, and that's a much more complicated, conversation. But African philosophy, right? Discussing African philosophy, which is a meta-philosophical enterprise, that faces many challenges. One of them is the presupposition of what counts as philosophy, and we're familiar with that meta-philosophical debate. The second one is the misconceptions, miseducation, and prejudices about the historical origins of talking about African philosophy, okay, and African philosophers. Ionut just brought up, for instance, St. Augustine, and it's very tricky when folks talk about St. Augustine, about his Berber and origins, the questions about his Roman citizenship, issues like that. And also there is this problem in that we tend to think and impose upon the past the way we look at people today. So we look at contemporary Berbers and we imagine that the Berbers of St. Augustine's time were the same, okay? There's also the problem of the impact of colonialism, not only on the African continent and its subsequent history, but also on philosophical practices, even by colonizers. In other words, we're used to talking about the colonization of the mind, right, of colonized peoples. But what we do is we take colonialism outside its interactive relational framework. And this leads to something ironic and paradoxical, because it means that when one colonizes, one is also colonizing oneself, because it makes one invest in sets of beliefs that are false. So in effect, there's not only the production of the lies or the misrepresentation of reality to dominate it, but the investments also puts the dominator in a false reality. There's also the addition of hegemony, which makes the question of transformation difficult. And then, of course, there's the vastness of the field, right? which encompasses ancient through contemporary philosophy. So when we say African philosophy, we're really talking about philosophy for the most part, and this is a very tricky one. This will challenge certain hegemons. But we're talking about philosophy across a lot of the critical reflection of our species, what we call Homo sapiens. And this is mainly because Homo sapiens, as we know, evolved in Africa. Now, even the notion of origins and interpretations, those notions face challenges, because implicit in every notion of an origin is a metaphysics. And guiding concepts of interpretations are epistemological frameworks that are also linked to metaphysical ideas. For instance, if one looks at an interpretation as an isolated versus an interrelated, right, understanding, then one is going to deal with the question of connections, relations, and problems of structural meanings. Now, since I only have a short time, I'm just going to summarize some issues. But again, I stress what I'm talking about is way larger than this moment affords. Now, for histories of translations in African philosophy, that also is complicated, okay? And it's complicated primarily because it often presupposes European translators of African thought. But we should bear in mind that the history has been a mixed bag that included Africans themselves. In the slave trades, plural, there were Africans such as Kugano and Ikayano, who wrote, although they wrote in English, they were native speakers of Fanti, for instance, Iwe, and the varieties of other West African languages. And they brought those ideas in translation into the European context. And if we were to look at the situation of Haiti, for instance, if you look at the writings of Antonin Firmin, right? These are individuals who, again, were in contexts where they actually were working in a multilinguistic framework, from French to the varieties of African languages of the enslaved population. And as a consequence, the scholarship can reflect those translation challenges. And then, as many of you already know, they're the exemplars not only of Arabic, Latin, and Greek commentaries, but also, and Hebrew, if we, and also, especially if we think in terms of Latin, it's very tricky because if we think of Josephus, we're talking about things that are written in Latin from someone who could read through Hebrew and read through Metaneter and read through the variety of other languages, including Aramaic. And then we go to Giza, Amharic, etc. And we could also think of early Christian and Jewish writers in North Africa. And we already brought up St. Augustine, of Oregon, and varieties of others, all the way through to Muslim writers such as Ibn Khaldun in Tunisia, all the way through to Christians in Ethiopia, such as Jacob, Zara Jacob, and Walter Hewat in Ethiopia. And in more recent times, and again, Africana is vast. So we're talking about millennia over millennia of work, but more contemporary work. We could think of translations that are particularly rich from Ghanaian, such as Kwame Gichea or Kwasi Wirudu, and Senegalese scholars from Cheikh Anta Diop all the way through to Suleiman Bashir Diagne, and Congolese such as Theophile Obenga all the way through to V.Y. Mudimbe, and Kenyans, which include D.A. Masolo, and Nigerians Olufemi Taiwo, not the young one, the older one at Cornell University, and Kiro Nzegwu, and Tunde Bewaji. And among African diasporic scholars, we could think of, for instance, the Africologists, Molefe Sante, Molana Karenga, Charles Finch. And we could also think of the Africana philosophical ones in Canada, such as Chike Jeffers or myself. Now, I should say straight up, given the topic of this meeting, that Kwasi Wirudu's Cultural Universes in Particulars is a very useful text, mainly because he deals with problems of translation in terms of addressing the fallacies of isomorphism. And by that, what he does is bring up that there are moments of intranslatables, and in the moments of intranslatables, one has to bring something to communicate and learn the non-translatable term. But this often leads to the generation of new ideas. And this many of you are already familiar with if you think through the various commentaries that go through from Persian all the way through to Hebrew to Latin, etc., and then put back into Greek, particularly if we talk about someone like Aristotle. Now, there is African philosophy in the sense of philosophy practiced historically among people who had no reason to refer to themselves as African. So that's one of the tricky parts here. Although there's evidence that such self-identification was made in antiquity among some peoples of the ancient past, not in terms of a continental understanding, but in terms of the idea of human origins. And the language of Meduneter, right, which is the language spoke in Kemet, or what was later known as Egypt, which is, again, a very vast country. We could think of some of the terms such as Afrika, which also just means from the source or from the origins or from the beginning. And you could see that in some of the work of the 19th century British scholar, Gerald Massey. Now, given that, there are some things I'm just going to go through very quickly, okay? First, okay, well, I just brought up one, but second, there's the disciplinary formation of building African philosophy in the global framework of Euro-modernity. Now, this is tricky since it links to professional practices that are only part of the story of African philosophy. And this is hard for many people to understand because when we work as professional scholars and professional philosophers, we're often textual. But as we know, most philosophy is actually not done textually. It's not written. And so one of the tricky things is by the time that tiny fragment of articulating ideas in the form of writing is presented, one has to construct a whole world of ideas that the text may be referring to. Then there is the struggle against textual and linguistic reductionism. And we could think of the word philosophy as an example, and I won't go into the details here, but one of the errors emerge from trying to look at, for instance, the Greek language as an isolated purity, when many languages are actually creolized interactive elements of a variety of languages, and they draw upon those and use various terms. For instance, there's a lot of Meduneter, which is a language that precedes Greek, in the Greek language. Now, there is also the problem of Eurocentrism and temporal reductionism. Eurocentrism tends to say an idea as an idea because of the prejudices that impose upon Europe, the idea that Europe has a kind of intrinsic philosophical sense. It leads to the idea that somehow concepts such as philosophy or even concepts such as modern must be fundamental, or even ancient must be fundamentally European. And so it affects the way we think of the past, but also the way we think of recent times and the present. There's also the problem of focusing so much on Eurocentrism, which is the other danger, that the work of focusing on African philosophy is lost. So this leads to another problem. There is also the problem of authenticity narratives. And authenticity narratives often seek forms of purity as a concept of origin. And I've already given a hint of that. There's a tendency to look, for instance, what is a purely African thought, or purely, or within the different African groups, whether they're Nubian or Kemetan or Egyptian, or even when we look at Europeans, whether we're thinking of a Greek and Latin, we tend to look for something pure, but that is fallacious. Now, I've already hinted at this by using the word creolization, which is discussed in writings by, for instance, Mike Monahan and Jane Anna Gordon. And basically, the point is that despite the heavily creolized reality of Europe, disguised as European purity, there's an expectation of thought in Africa to be singular and pure for it to be African on the one hand, but then on the other hand, there's a tendency to have an introduced or a not out of Africa, but into Africa thesis that then presupposes a form of impurity of African thought. Now, a lot of this stuff is similar to the logic of writing. For instance, there are many people who would look at the writing, but not when it's in the European context. And even if the script was actually introduced into the European context, it's treated as legitimate because of a presupposition of Europeans as writers. But we should bear in mind that humanity's presence, as I mentioned already, in Africa and its movement out of Africa basically have never been linear. Thus, there's a back and forth ongoing complexity that makes purity narratives, when we bring that into translation, fallacious. Next, there's the problem of de-intellectualization. And de-intellectualization is where there's more of an ethnographic than an intellectual engagement with ideas in African philosophy. Now, I address this issue in my book, An Introduction to Africana Philosophy, in which I focus on three problematics. In other words, I organized a book around problems of philosophical anthropology. In other words, what does it mean to be human? Discourses of freedom, and metacritiques of reason and justification. But I could add a fourth, which is the problem of redemptive narratives. And redemptive narratives tend to be struggles over justified existence. Now, since I'm already short on time, I'm going to conclude with three examples of approaches to addressing some of these ideas, because as I said, there's a whole lot in African philosophy and a lot around these issues of translation. But what I'm just going to do is start with something ancient, because there's a way in which this ancient stuff connect quite a bit with some contemporary debates, okay? Now, the ancient, we could look at first pedagogically, and second, more intellectually in terms of philosophical foci of familiar areas of philosophy ranging from metaphysics to ethics to political philosophy. Now, the pedagogical is straightforward. What one should do is simply teach the primary sources. And it may seem like a very straightforward thing, a very strange thing to say, but often African thought is talked about rather than engaged with. So I would recommend, for instance, if one considers a letter of Antef, and this is from 4,000 years ago, I usually open my courses by having the students discuss the letter, and I use my translation. But the letter, what's important about this letter, it's a reflection on the very idea of philosophy. In other words, it's a metaphilosophical reflection. And it's an examination in which he says things such as, what it is to deal with what people would otherwise overlook, what it is to deal with the concept of clarity, clear-sightedness, what is going on in the notion of actions and the evaluation of actions. And he also talks about ancient writings, and that's a whole other issue. If we're looking at a person from 4,000 years ago talking about ancient writings to him, you could imagine what was lost when we're talking about the burnings of the libraries of Alexandria, etc. But he also goes on to deal with this meta problem, this complex paradox of what it means to attempt to be wiser than a sage. Now, what's interesting is why this is pedagogical is that I don't have to get into these silly debates about who created or started philosophy. Because if the students are engaging in something, they know that Antef didn't begin philosophy, but the fact that it's 4,000 years ago means that the ongoing hegemonic narrative of philosophy beginning about 2,500 years ago is just simply false. And at that moment, the students can at least begin to engage a different kind of debate. Now, in terms of ancient metaphysics, what's interesting is if we look at writings, whether it's from Akhenaten and Nefertiti, 13th century BCE, we can see in that ideas such as the emanation theory of reality. And what's interesting about the emanation theory of reality, which is the idea that that which causes appearance doesn't itself appear, this is something that's rather insightful that makes its way all the way through the history of philosophy, beyond African philosophy, in terms of what we could see in theories all the way through to how we deal with problems in contemporary science. In other words, although it's ancient, the emanation of theory of reality has implications from a variety of issues, from monism, monotheism, all the way through to philosophical ideas about relationality, etc. And that relationality metaphysics, in other words, this core notion that philosophy is to deal with reality, this is a core concept that actually can guide through to various contemporary discussions or in varieties of African philosophies. Now, if we're going to get into more normative areas, we could look at the Snuviškis, or it's known mostly as the peasant's tale. But what's important about it is that it's a meditation on the concept of mayat. And what's crucial about this is that mayat is a concept that's not neatly translated. It's a lot like, for instance, for those of you who read Greek, the translation of dikaisune, even though we have substance and dike in there, again, there is an error in simply just translating it neatly into the concept of justice. And the ancient concept here connects to breath, balance, truth, health, etc. And it is something that is not only crucial to understanding a variety of contemporary African philosophies, whether it's in the form of Ubuntu in South Africa, or we're dealing with certain normative concepts, for instance, among the communities in Senegal, in Ghana, etc. But if we're dealing with contemporary debates, we could consider issues around the decolonization, if we will, of certain concepts, such as the methodological framework of looking at political institutions exclusively in terms of justice. If we think of right now the problems we're dealing with as we look at health, for instance, with the pandemic, and the questions of the forms of inequalities and issues of equity that affect pandemics, we can see that although this is an ancient concept, it can have contemporary relevance. Now, within that framework, I close by simply saying that this little outline can show not only the question of the vastness of African philosophy, but the fact that it rejects the idea of an isolated purity means it is also interactive, creolized, and connected to varieties of other ancient philosophies, and can actually then be put productively in conversations with Asian and Native American philosophies. And it, in effect, then demonstrates some of the limitations of more reductive forms of contemporary professional philosophy. There is, in other words, and this is connected to something I've written about in another book called Disciplinary Decadence, there's a form of transcendence of disciplinary decadence through forms of, paradoxically, philosophy beyond philosophy. And the philosophy beyond philosophy, in this sense, means that one has to be willing to deal with the questions of not looking at philosophy as isomorphically reduced to one set of terms, but as something metacritical. It is open to possibilities that can be communicative, intersubjective, and thus productive. So I'll just stop